If you've seen Squid Game, you probably remember the mysterious man in the suit. The one who approaches desperate individuals, invites them to play a simple game of Ddakji, and then hands them a card with a phone number. This is the recruiter, the first step in pulling contestants into the deadly survival competition. On the surface, he might not seem as bad as the masked guards or the game's masterminds, but in reality, he plays a crucial role in luring vulnerable people into a death trap. But what if Squid Game wasn't a hidden underground operation? What if law enforcement caught up with the recruiter and held him accountable? Under South Korean law, how serious are his crimes? How many years would he spend in prison? In this analysis, we'll break down his illegal actions, compare them to real-world cases, and determine just how long he'd be behind bars if justice was served. The recruiter may not be the one pulling the trigger, but without him, Squid Game wouldn't have contestants. He carefully selects vulnerable individuals, lures them into the deadly competition, and ensures their participation through deception, coercion, and sometimes physical force. Let's break down his most serious crimes. One of the recruiter's biggest offenses is kidnapping and abduction. He approaches people in desperate financial situations and manipulates them into playing a simple game. While the initial encounter seems harmless, the real crime happens when he offers them a ride, one that ends with them being knocked unconscious with gas and transported against their will. Under South Korean law, kidnapping for profit or criminal intent is a serious offense. According to the Criminal Act of South Korea, Article 288, kidnapping or abducting a person with the intent to harm or exploit them carries a penalty of at least 5 years in prison. If it results in significant harm or death, the sentence can be life imprisonment. Because the recruiter knowingly delivers people to an underground death game, his actions fall under kidnapping for exploitation, which would push his sentence toward the maximum penalty. The recruiter isn't just a kidnapper, he's also guilty of human trafficking. In Squid Game, players don't just participate voluntarily, they are manipulated and coerced into a situation where their lives are at stake. South Korea has strict anti-human trafficking laws under the Act on the Punishment of Acts of Arranging Sexual Traffic, as well as international agreements like the United Nations Palermo Protocol. According to these laws, any person who recruits, transports, or transfers individuals through deception or coercion for exploitation can face up to life imprisonment. Since the recruiter targets financially desperate individuals, deceives them, and delivers them into a deadly system, his actions fit the definition of human trafficking for exploitative labor, which is a high-level felony under South Korean and international law. While the recruiter is mostly a smooth talker, he also uses physical force. In some encounters, he slaps potential contestants repeatedly under the guise of a game. While this may seem minor compared to kidnapping, physical assault, even in a controlled setting, is a crime in South Korea. Under the Criminal Act, assault is punishable by up to 2 years in prison or a fine of 5 million KRW, $3,800. If it results in serious injury, the sentence increases. Since the recruiter uses force to manipulate contestants into submission, this charge would add extra years to his sentence. To determine how long the recruiter would spend in prison, we need to look at the laws that apply to his crimes. South Korean law takes kidnapping, human trafficking, and assault very seriously. Additionally, international human rights agreements also shape how these crimes are punished. South Korea has strict laws against crimes that involve coercion, kidnapping, and trafficking. The key legal provisions that would apply to the recruiter include kidnapping and abduction, Article 288 Criminal Act. At least 5 years in prison, with the possibility of life imprisonment if serious harm occurs. Human trafficking, Act on the Punishment of Human Trafficking, 2014. Any form of forced recruitment, deception, or coercion for exploitation can result in up to life in prison. Assault, Article 260 Criminal Act. Physical violence, even without serious injury, can lead to up to 2 years in prison or a fine. Given the premeditated nature of his actions, the recruiter wouldn't get a light sentence. If prosecuted, he could easily face decades behind bars. Beyond South Korean law, the recruiter's actions violate international human rights treaties. South Korea is a signatory to the United Nations Palermo Protocol, which criminalizes human trafficking for forced labor or exploitation. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which recognizes freedom from forced servitude and exploitation as a fundamental right. If the recruiter were caught and tried under international law, he could be held accountable not just in South Korea but by global human rights courts as well. His crimes align with organized human trafficking, meaning he could receive life imprisonment in multiple jurisdictions. Should I rewrite this or move to the next part, sentencing considerations? Now that we've established the laws that apply to the recruiter, let's look at the factors that would influence his sentencing. Courts don't just consider the crimes committed, they also weigh aggravating factors, which increase the punishment, and mitigating factors, which might reduce it. Several key factors would increase the recruiter's sentence. Multiple victims. The recruiter isn't responsible for just one or two people. He systematically recruits dozens, if not hundreds, of contestants. The larger the victim count, the harsher the sentence. Premeditation. His actions are carefully planned. He doesn't randomly abduct people. He specifically targets the most vulnerable individuals, those in financial ruin, making the crime even more manipulative and cruel. Deception and coercion. Unlike traditional kidnapping, where victims are physically restrained, the recruiter tricks people into willingly following him before they realize they're trapped. Courts treat coercion and fraud-based crimes very seriously. Direct role in a criminal organization. Since the recruiter is part of a larger illegal system, his actions may be classified under organized crime laws, which increase penalties. With these factors, the recruiter's sentence would likely be severe, leaning toward decades in prison or even a life sentence. Could anything reduce the recruiter's sentence? Possibly, but it depends on his circumstances. Coercion or duress. If he could argue that he was forced to work for the organization under threat of harm, a court might show some leniency. However, he doesn't seem to be acting under duress, making this defense weak. Lack of direct violence. Unlike some Squid Game participants who actively kill others, the recruiter doesn't directly harm his victims. Aside from occasional slaps, this might help reduce his sentence slightly. Plea deal and cooperation. If he testifies against the higher-ups running Squid Game, prosecutors could offer him a lighter sentence. However, given the gravity of his crimes, he would still face serious time behind bars. Even with these factors, the recruiter wouldn't escape a long prison sentence. The best case? A reduced life sentence with parole after several decades. To better understand how the recruiter would be sentenced, let's compare his actions to real-life criminal cases and similar fictional characters. South Korea has strict laws against kidnapping and human trafficking, and past cases show how severe the punishments can be. Lee Young-hak case, 2017. A man who kidnapped and murdered a teenager received life imprisonment. Though the recruiter doesn't kill directly, the scale of his actions could justify a similar or harsher sentence. Gang-based human trafficking cases. South Korean courts have given 20-plus years in prison to members of organized crime rings involved in kidnapping and forced labor, which mirrors the recruiter's role in Squid Game. Other fictional characters involved in coercion and human trafficking have faced severe consequences. Jigsaw's accomplices, Saw series, characters who trick victims into deadly games are usually killed or arrested when caught. The Hunger Games recruiters. If the recruiter existed in a similar world, he'd likely be hunted down and executed if the system collapsed. Gale, the Hunger Games. Even though he didn't directly kill anyone, he still faced exile for his indirect role in mass casualties. If Squid Game followed real-world laws, the recruiter wouldn't just disappear, he'd be arrested, prosecuted, and likely spend the rest of his life in prison. If Squid Game were real and South Korean authorities caught the recruiter, his fate would be clear: a long prison sentence, likely for life. His role in kidnapping, human trafficking, and coercion makes him responsible for luring countless people into a deadly game. With multiple victims, premeditation, and ties to organized crime, the recruiter's case would be taken very seriously. Real-life cases in South Korea show that kidnapping and trafficking crimes can result in 20+ years in prison or even life sentences. Even if he tried to cooperate with law enforcement, he would still face decades behind bars. Unlike some contestants who fought to survive, the recruiter willingly took part in the exploitation. If justice were served, he wouldn't be scouting for new players. He'd be spending the rest of his life behind bars, paying for the lives he helped destroy,